Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just really want to pose a couple of questions about along the lines of Part 2, which is substantively a procedural, administrative and miscellaneous section to the bill. It does, in Part 2, under Clause 97, go into some detail around the reports that are to be provided to the review panel for the purposes of reviewing a public protection order. And this is an important, I think, section, given that we've only just recently debated as a select committee information that is provided to parole boards as a matter of course when considering a parole. And it's a useful comparison, I think, to make, because whilst this schedule sets out information that should be provided to review panel, it states under Clause 97F that any further or supplementary reports requested by the review panel to be provided by any person, including the chief executive, the manager of the prison, or the residence in which the person is detained, and any health assessor. The issue that we've discovered when it comes to reports provided to the parole board, and would likewise be an issue with the review panel, is that you can only, you know what you know. You request information that you know might be available. But for instance, we've seen with the parole board that orders that are made in this civil regime weren't routinely being provided to the parole board, and that a privacy an agreement under the Judicature Bill, I believe it is going to allow an agreement between the Ministry of Justice and the Parole Board to ensure that actually, rather than having to request information, it's provided for as a matter of course. Now, this may not be an issue when it comes to the review panel. I haven't spent enough time looking at it. But it's just something I would flag with the Minister, that when we do have a case of requiring a review panel to ask for information, actually we need to put the responsibility on those who hold the information to provide what they consider to be important, because it's very difficult to make a direct request for information you don't know exists. I also want to just go briefly ask a couple of questions on some other functional parts of the bill, how the residences will be established, who will be employed to run them. Is it anticipated by the government that, given that we're only likely to have 5 to 12 offenders held under this Act, that there will be the establishment of simply one residence on prison grounds? And if so, has consideration been given to which prison grounds that would be? And what effect that would have on the footprint of the prison ground. Obviously, some of our more modern prison facilities have been constructed in such a way that there's work programs on site and various other rehabilitation programs, and to what degree would that be interrupted by having to partition off a piece of land in order to allow one of these residences to be established? So if the Minister could perhaps share whether or not there's been any specific thought given to one site or multi-sites. Also, whether or not by having one site, for instance, if there is one site, which obviously would save a significant amount of money and cost based on the regulatory impact statement, was a consideration for the government, whether or not that breaches in any other the policies that are held by corrections around allowing offenders to try and be as close as possible to family. If they, for instance, have served their sentence in Auckland Prison, but actually the one site in which these residences are constructed is Christchurch, whether or not we're going to have any ongoing issues with that, given that this is a civil regime rather than part of our corrections, our punishment, as it were. Equally, obviously, there's some in Clause 100, it talks about establishing residence managers, wondering whether or not these will be corrections office staff, because it states that a person must not perform any functions under the Corrections Act while that person is a residence manager. So obviously it's stipulated here that they won't have powers as given by the Corrections Act, But is it anticipated that they will have the same degree of training that a corrections officer or staffer would? Or would they be, for instance, more in line with a social work qualification? What threshold test would we like them to meet? Because obviously a corrections officer staff has a particular set of thresholds that they must meet. Mr Chair?
Jacinda Ardern.
I also wonder, given that this is not strictly going to be considered in the same way that a regular corrections facility, whether or not the same powers that are held of inspection by a Member of Parliament, for instance, will apply, and that is the ability for us at any time within the Corrections Act to visit a corrections facility. Will that same power apply for the residences to at any point under the Corrections Act visit in order to inspect and ensure conditions are appropriate and that the legislation is being met? Will that apply for these residences in the same way? I think that's an important point. That is, we provide an inspectorate function, and particularly given that this regime is not intended to be the same as a prison, making sure those checks and balances are in place are important. Now, that may have already been considered, and my apologies if that has been stipulated, because I see that during the debate on part one, that actually there was some discussion around Parliament being provided reports on those who are covered by protection by these public orders, and so equally interested to whether or not we have that ongoing role of inspection. I also would like to know whether or not the residents would be covered by our public corrections management. So will these residence managers be contracted out? Would we see the likes of Serco operating these residences, or will they be held within the public regime? Important question for us on the side of the House, because we have very strong views about any form of our justice system, even one that's even this element that falls within the civil regime being contracted out. We see it as a money gathering exercise by third parties. We don't think it necessarily leads to any better outcomes, and in the end we think the taxpayer ends up footing the bill. And we've seen numerous examples where Serco has inappropriately manage the facilities that they've been running offshore, and that we've seen some debacles around the way they've been managed. Even in New Zealand we have our own examples where we have higher numbers of prisoner-on-prisoner assaults within our private prisons, where they're not subjected to the same information sharing regime, so it's not as transparent. We'd be interested to know whether or not it's the intention of the government to contract out the management of these facilities in the same way they have some of our previously public prisons, or even the prisons that they're building, such as Wiri. It wouldn't surprise me if, for instance, the government's already decided that the site that the residents would be one of these new facilities, given that they are currently under construction, and it would provide an ability to do that. That's a piece of information I'd like the Minister to clarify. I think it's incredibly important to the way that these residents will operate in the future.